What's up, Marvel fans? We're the Hills Maniacs, and today we're going to be giving our review on Ant-Man and the Wasp. So basically, the reason we're doing this, obviously, is because Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania comes out next week, February 17th. We're looking forward to that, and we will be covering that on our channel as well, so keep an eye out for that. And we did a review of the first Ant-Man movie last week, so go check that out if you haven't seen it already. And let's get started. So pretty much, there's nothing really much to say about this movie in terms of things that I liked. I mean, I think this was mostly just meant to be like a filler movie to get us from, I forget what movie was out before, into Avengers Infinity War and stuff. Actually, into Endgame, really, because it's, especially after the end credits scene, so it didn't really feel like this movie needed to happen, in a similar fashion to how I feel about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Like, other than they got Mantis, was pretty much added to the team and stuff. That was pretty much the only reason for that movie, because they needed her against Thanos and stuff
and
like
they
that.
needed Ego dead.
And that's kind of how I figure this movie was as well. It was a fun movie to watch. I mean, similar to the first Ant-Man movie, it was just kind of, for me, the plot was a bit all over the place. There's like multiple villains essentially throughout the movie, and a lot of stuff going on that doesn't really need to be there. I know they needed this to set up like Ant-Man getting trapped in the quantum realm, but they could have done that probably, I don't know, maybe in Infinity War or something. Have Ant-Man doing something in that movie that leads him getting trapped in the quantum realm or whatever. I don't feel like we needed this movie.
Yeah, I agree. This movie was kind of pointless. And hey, it might come into play later though, because apparently Ghost is supposed to be on the Thunderbolts. Because that's not, a random just throw-in character.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they haven't even followed up with what happened to Ghost after Ant-Man and the Wasp.
Yeah, she wasn't really a great villain in this
I
either.
understand that Quantumania is the first Ant-Man movie after Endgame, or after Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I guess they wouldn't have really had a reason to follow up with it, but you could still, they've mentioned Scott Lang and stuff, so like you could have even had Ghost be part of Endgame when everybody came back. Like you could have had her show up
right
with Scott or something, and Hank and all them, and just like, but there's just no mention of Ghost at all.
Right.
They needed this movie basically to trap Scott in the quantum realm.
And
that happens in the end credits.
That's the end credit scene anyway.
So
yeah, I know. I kind of liked when you look back to the first Ant-Man movie. You had Darren Cross as the villain in that one. I think he was a better villain than Ghost was in this one, just because her story was more based on just the quantum realm and stuff like that, and she had a vendetta against Hank Pym and stuff. But I feel like Darren Cross had more of a villain vibe to him, because at the end of this one, essentially, Ghost sort of gets redeemed because Janet Van Dyne helps her sort of recover, or takes some of her quantum powers away, phasing, I guess, or the phasing, it's the quantum sickness she had or whatever. So she kind of gets redeemed at the end of this movie. So it didn't really it wasn't really necessary to have her as a villain, I guess. I don't know who else they could have chosen to be a villain in this movie from the comics or whatever, but I feel like Yellow Jacket, Darren Cross in the first one was a way better villain than Ghost was in this one, and it made more sense for that one too, because he's in a similar way to with Tony Stark, how I said this last week, how Obadiah Stane was his counterpart. He was jealous of all the attention Tony was getting and wanted to kill Tony to take his tech for himself and all that kind of stuff. And it was a similar thing with Darren Cross and Hank Pym as well. And that was just a better told story overall compared to this one, where, you didn't just have Ghost as the villain in this one either. You had the mysterious benefactor, and I think the guy's name was Sonny Birch or whatever, that was trying to take the lab from Hank Pym and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you had the police chasing Scott the whole movie. Well, it did introduce us to Agent Woo, who shows up later in WandaVision, and he's a okay character. He's funny, whatever. But other than that, nothing else really important happened in this movie. There's not much more we can say, really. If you enjoyed this movie, that good for you. It was a fun movie. So was Thor: Love and Thunder was just funny and comedy, but it wasn't really in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really accomplish much.
Well, and I think for me the worst part of this was the uncontinuity, if that's a word. It is now. Uncontinuity. Incontinuity.
Sure.
It's a word now.
We invented it.
But is how they basically contradict everything, not just with the quantum realm stuff, but just with the Ant-Man stuff kind of in general, but especially with the way that Ant-Man works, because they said in the first one, and we kind of touched on this in the last video, where things are supposed to weigh the same when they're shrunk as they would if they're bigger. So when you look at this movie and Hank is just basically wheeling around the lab with as like a suitcase type of thing, like technically it should weigh the same as a building.
True.
It's still a building, just shrunk. So you shouldn't be able to move it that easily, or it's like the tank on the key ring, in the first one, or the Thomas thing at the end when it grows and busts through the roof, and it shouldn't have did that. But it's just, there's just so much contradiction in the Ant-Man movies that it doesn't really help build up the story at all. It
Right.
kind of, it's all over the place. If they would have left that line out about like time and space working different, I think the quantum realm itself could be different, because you get into the quantum realm and Janet Van Dyne's in there and she's aged, and she knows it's been like 30 years or whatever, and yet if time's supposed to work differently in the quantum realm, how does she know it's been 30 years? Scott even says, in Endgame, like after he comes out of the quantum realm and goes to the Avengers headquarters, he says it's only been like a week for him or whatever.
5 hours.
Or 5 hours,
Yeah. Even though it was
however
5
long
years.
it was, because it was 5 years in the real world. So obviously time doesn't work the same, and yet Janet knows that it's been 30 years. I don't know, maybe she has something that tells her how long it's been in the real world or whatever, but
Kang.
It could be Kang.
Maybe we'll find out more.
Yeah,
in
I mean they
Quantumania,
could they have all these things that they could talk about in Quantumania, so we might get answers. But as of right now, this stuff just kind of doesn't make any sense, and I think they just were so eager to make a second Ant-Man movie to get Scott Lang in the quantum realm in the end credits, that they basically didn't care about the movie being part of everything else and having that continuity that it needed to build off of, and they just needed him in the quantum realm in the end credits.
Right. I mean, one of my favorite scenes, at least, I think, was the end credits scene where they did get Scott into the quantum realm, because I thought that was a nice way to tie into, well, this is what Scott's been doing while the events of Infinity War are going on. Now, I don't know why. I mean, it was in California, so I guess you could argue, like, maybe nobody over there heard about the battle in, like, New York and stuff, or in Wakanda, because Infinity War was essentially taking place at the same time as this movie, because at the end we see Janet, Hank, and Hope all get dusted from Thanos' snap while Scott's still in the quantum realm. So I like the way that they tied that in, and they showed all that, because now he's trapped, and you get this sense of, like, well, how's he going to get out of this? And then it did make you want to see Endgame, but the rest of this movie was just kind of like a bunch of nonsense, just meant to be a funny movie, just until it gets to that point.
I wish they would have had the end credit scene actually be part of the actual movie.
That's true.
I think it would have still gave you the same kind of build to Endgame that it would have given you being the end credits. I mean, yes, it was worth the wait to sit in the theater and watch it, but I think now, like, looking back on it, it's like the way they ended this movie, they could have just ended it with that and then had something else be the end credit scene, either a preview for the next movie that was coming out, or whatever it was, and then just go from there, and we would still know that Hank and Janet and Hope all disappeared and Scott was trapped in the quantum realm. So it's, you could have had that be part of the movie, because there's a lot of people that don't stay after to watch the end credits.
Right.
So if you didn't watch the end credit scene even once it was out on DVD before Endgame came out, you'd have no clue where Scott was, you know. And another thing, you know, you brought up earlier about it taking place at the same time kind of as Infinity War, at least the part when Thanos snaps his fingers at the end. So I guess the whole battle would take place.
Yeah,
so
it's
like,
all kind of happening concurrently.
Why didn't, I mean, I know Scott kind of said that, like, he wanted out of the Avengers, you know, because it was part of the Sokovia Accords or whatever, but you would figure that if he hears something this big going on, he would be willing to step back in. I know he wanted to stay out of it for Cassie and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But, I mean, even you could have had a scene where him and Hope were at least mentioning it, you know, or talking about it or something. I'm sure he would have heard
hear it on the
about
radio
it.
even or something.
Or even if one of them calls him, you know, if Falcon calls him or Cap calls him, whatever, and he could at least turn it down, but at least have it be, because it's supposed to take place at the same time as Infinity War. And it's hard to show that without actually including something from Infinity War, which is why I think doing that in the end credits with the snap and everybody disappearing, I don't think it worked as well, because it doesn't give you that notion that this is happening at the same time until the snap happens and they all disappear in the end credits. Right. You know, you don't know when this is taking place. If you didn't look it up, or somebody didn't tell you that this was happening at the same time.
All you know is it's after Civil War.
Yeah, that's all you know, is that
it's
after that. And then and it's after the Sokovia Accords and stuff and all that.
But all in all, as a sequel, I didn't really like this movie as much as the first one. I don't think this really was that great of a sequel compared to some of the other sequels in the MCU. I think that I'd give this like a 2 out of 5, because it was fun and there were some funny moments and stuff like that, just like in the first one, but I don't think it was as good of a movie as the original Ant-Man movie. I hope Quantumania, I mean, it seems like it's going to be a more serious movie, so maybe it won't have as much comedy in that as this one does. Even the first one felt a little bit more serious.
Yeah.
It did have some comedy, but it was sprinkled in there nicely. But this movie was just meant to be a filler, as we said, you know, to get us from point A to point B or to build to a post-credit scene, really, that you didn't really. They could have done it in a different way, I feel like.
Well, and I think they also used it more to explore the quantum realm a lot more, so that going into Quantumania, we'll have that explanation of, you know, if Janet brings up about the world within the quantum realm, like, we already know about that because they've kind of hinted at it in Ant-Man and the Wasp, and I think that this was basically just like you said, a filler movie to just kind of, there had to be a Marvel movie released in that year, whenever it was, you know, to build to Endgame. Yeah, they definitely, they didn't need this movie. I gave the last one between a 2 and a 3. I think this one's pretty much between 1 and 2. It was just, I mean, it was bad. Nothing against the people in this movie. It's just the plot of this movie, it wasn't planned out properly, I don't think. So I think it just kind of, it was all over the place.
They essentially needed something for Scott to do, to have a reason for him not being in, you know, the battle in Infinity War.
It's essentially the same with Ragnarok.
Yeah,
you know, it was so Thor and Hulk wouldn't be there for Infinity War.
For Civil War even, and Infinity War. Yeah. So yep, that's pretty much all this movie was. But let us know what you guys thought of Ant-Man and the Wasp down in the comments section. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching the video, everyone.
Remember, leave the scumbaggery at home, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Bye, guys.